I want to say a little bit about what I've been up to in the last 10 or 15 years, but this is by no means the Stephen Perz show, as you're going to see. This is Stephen facilitating the work of a whole bunch of other people, is what this really is. And I'll preface this, and sort of the connection is reflecting on what others have said. Social movements arose throughout the southwestern Amazon, not just in Acre, beginning in the 1970s, in some sense as a response to new highways, new roads, new people coming to the region that resulted in social conflicts, and others have talked in much greater depth than I can about that, okay? And we know what resulted. This ends up in the formation of the Chico Mendes Reserve, among other kinds of protected and sustainable use areas in Acre, Pando, Madre de Dios, and other parts of this frontier. All of that is merely a precursor to what has happened since. The Carvalho government convenes IRSA, okay, in 2000, and they were talking about billions and billions of dollars in new infrastructure projects. And premier among those was the paving of what we now call the Interoceanic Highway right through the southwestern Amazon, okay? And this coincided with other Brazilian initiatives. And not surprisingly, given the earlier history of mobilization, this new highway also led to a lot of mobilization. Is what happened last time about to repeat itself, was the question that a lot of people began to worry about. And so we again see mobilization, but it begins to take on some new forms. So here's the official planning route. Long story behind that, I'm going to skip over. So here's the skating. Here's what some of the signs along the highway in Peru were suggesting, that progress has arrived. The classical development trappings. And in some sense, it was very real and very physical. Where it took 3 days, now it will take 7 hours. Okay, and we can travel around all year. And there's obvious benefits for that, accessing health, accessing education. No one's questioning that. But there was a lot of question about what would, the bad things that might happen as well. And this is what brings us to the MAP initiative. MAP was named after Madre de Dios, Acre, and Pando, the states that formed the trinational frontier. If you look on a political map of the world, you can find it here. And they began to bring people together across national boundaries, government representatives, NGOs, including Perz, communities, church groups, labor syndicates, and all of the rest, to talk about classical themes that we know and love here in TCD, ranging from development to conservation to justice to participation in public policy making. Okay? And so, when Marianne and I and others would show up, we'd end up in the back behind the media, so the important people, okay, local politicians and leaders up front could hold meetings. By the time you get to the mid to late 2000s, the governors of all 3 states, there's Vino Marquez, are participating, and they were basically expected to get up and say what they were going to do as a result of suggestions being made by the MAP initiative and its various participants, which were basically the public. Whoever showed up was there to participate. Okay? This growth began to spin off what we now call the mini-MAPs, which were basically working groups that took up specific topics. Governance was one, biodiversity was another, ecotourism. There were 15 or 20 operating at one point. And they began to propose policies, as I say, as the politicians felt like they had to say how they were going to respond. But they also began proposing projects. We need to have a project to do this or that, whether it was scientific and data collection or whether it was more conservation and development. And this is where I ended up sort of standing on the shoulders of many others, John, Marianne, and many others, because UF was regarded as a reasonably trusted outside organization because we had a long history in the region. And so we had organizations there coming to us saying, will you participate or even lead some of these projects? Because some of them became fairly complicated, and some of the local partners began to realize we need a partner that we can trust that also has a pretty high level of administrative capacity to deal with the amounts of money. So there are several projects here that I've been involved in, basically as the PI on the sciencey stuff, or as the chief of party, as USAID likes to say. And I'm going to skate through some of these things and mostly show you pictures and try to tell self-deprecating jokes. Okay. So there were a couple projects funded by the National Science Foundation. These were both big interdisciplinary programs in human social dynamics and a couple of natural and human systems, all with the proposition of collaborating, in this case with local universities, to try and address the question, what happens when you pave a road through a rainforest, okay, socially and ecologically. And so the first project we organized around several components. We sent the botanists out in the forest, okay, to go figure out what trees and what plant communities are actually out there along the road. Okay, and so here's all the little dots places where we went to visit. We ended up roughly doubling the number of samples in the regional herbarium as a result. We also had the socioeconomic component where we really emphasized land tenure questions along with livelihood type questions. We visited about 100 communities scattered all along roads across the region before we then revisited some of them to conduct interviews, and all these crazy squiggly box looking things are the places that we visited. And then there was the remote sensing part. This is what everybody really wanted to know because Brazil was setting deforestation targets, or at least the government of Acre was, and there was a lot of debate about whether it was deforestation. And so we worked with a lot of folks there. And you can see there were, even by 2005, there was already a fair amount of deforestation in Acre. But if you look carefully, down here in Peru, this is where the new section of the road was paved, and there was a fair amount of areas being opened up. And this is the gold mining area for those of you in Peru. This was the management team. This is where the complexity starts to emerge. We had people for all of the all the components, but also at all of the partner institutions. And it was basically a circus of over 20 people just to manage the different field teams. So each cell basically had its own field team, okay, composed of US students working with students from the partner universities. And so, we had a total of 21, faculty and other staff, and then we had almost 70 graduate students and other students working on it. So this is why I became sort of the coordinator. My job was to sit in offices and figure out who was taking which truck out and who needed what money. Everybody else are the ones who went out into the field. And, okay, I don't know what happened. This is a different slide on the second part of the project, because then once we had the data collected, I started working with engineers. If you know the folks down at ABE, Greg Kiker and Rafa Carvalho, participated on this, but we wanted to build a dynamic simulation model out of all these data and many other data. So not only could we look at what's already happened in the past, we could spin it forward in the future, okay? So if Bolivia decides to pave the road on their side, if Brazil embarks on certain policies, we haven't accounted for Bolsonaro yet, but you get the idea. We can begin to run scenarios as to what might happen in the future, but we did this in a very dialogic, participatory way, okay? And so this is when we began to hold workshops, and then we would go ask people, how they understood how the system was functioning. Where are people mining gold? And where are people running cows? And why do they do that there and not somewhere else? And then we would take those stories to Greg, and he would put them in the model. And then we bring the results from the model back to show to people, does this make sense? And they would usually say no, and then we would have to fix it. It was a very sort of iterative, participatory way. This was the cast of characters in the second project. As you can see, it was still fairly big. Those are the little projects. The big ones were the USAID projects, where it was an order of magnitude greater the amount of money being spent, okay? You can see that there are more partners. They're not just universities now. We have government agencies. We have several NGOs, okay? And so it was a much more complicated circus that we were going to manage here. There was a later consortium. The USAID continued their funding under what was called the Initiative for the Conservation of the Andean Amazon. Long story there, okay? Where again, it was a similar sort of formula where UF was leading a consortium, okay, with a lot of NGOs, government agencies, and all of them, I hasten to add, had their own networks of partners, kind of like what John was saying with Acre. This was our conservation and development model after somebody finally twisted my arm and tried to put it all on one page, but it all begins with a collaboration at the top, okay, where we have our partners, they have their partners, all right? And all of that leads into a series of consortium activities, very much along the lines of what you heard John talk about with Acre, where we combine science with the dissemination and exchange of that information as an input to management planning, okay, that then leads to plan implementation. Hopefully, that will lead to some kind of sustainable resource use that then has positive ramifications for ecosystem services and biodiversity. But the idea is to come up with a model that can be replicated, okay, so we can then scale it up and use it in other parts of the basin. This is what USAID found attractive about it. So it's very participatory, it links science to management, and it could be scaled. So I'm going to really skate now. We had some partners working with communities to establish their own tree nurseries so we can get involved in reforestation. We had some of our scientists and postdocs training people, many of them from those communities, on how to use certain kinds of technologies to estimate carbon and these other kinds of inputs to territorial management planning. We work with local schools on the children's forest model. to some success as we began to disseminate it around the region. And we began to do various kinds of territorial management planning. So it was the partners that developed a very participatory model, for example, of watershed management planning. This was the basic procedural technical manual that was developed in Brazil. Okay, but then this was adopted. You can see the switch in language. It was adopted as well in Peru and Bolivia. Okay, and then we began to do this in different watersheds. Okay, and what happened is when we did it in a little watershed, people went, well, we want the bigger watershed now because we liked how this happened. And so it began to develop its own demand that began to escape our grasp. Okay, a societal demand, which had driven all of this stuff in the first place, was only growing. This eventually in Acre ended up becoming state policy. This has gone on at the national level. I'm not sure where it ended up after that, but you can begin to see some of these trajectories and some of the approaches and the impacts. There was also management planning with regard to the highway question. So we worked with indigenous and other roadside communities in terms of managing their terrestrial as well as aquatic resources. Okay. In addition, the climate issue became a big deal after a series of droughts followed by floods starting in around 2006. So here we began to buy up old radios and implant them in rural schools to create early warning networks. Okay. Here we also have firefighters creating fire breaks in the rainforest. Okay, and people are also doing civil defense exercises. What if you and you all broke your legs? What are the rest of you people going to do to put out the fires? This is why there's people running around on stretchers. Okay, it's all preparation for what's going to happen in the Amazon in the 21st century. We began to produce weather bulletins that were better than the local weather service and hand those out. Okay, especially if there was a large rainfall event upriver in Peru, so the Brazilians downriver would know what's coming and be able to prepare in time. IPAN, that was mentioned earlier, is famous for producing these deforestation maps out of dynamic simulation models. The red stuff, the dark red, is what's supposed to happen in the future. They ended up at COP in Copenhagen in the side event where the governors, and again, so you can see Bino, this is the event where he got to meet Arnold Schwarzenegger when he was governor of California. We began to sign MOUs, and so they used this figure that they developed out of our project to basically scare everybody. Look what's going to happen in the future if you don't help conserve forest in Acre. And of course, everybody looked, and that was all scary, and so they signed off. In terms of some numbers, we managed to train about 10,000 people, protect about 2.5 million hectares, enact a bunch of policies and so forth, and leveraged a ton of money. Okay? This is how we did it, though. This is the other part of the complexity. This is how we managed the contract between the organizations. Here's the University of Florida. I think I'm A1, I'm not sure. But you can see all the little arrows. I love network diagrams now. But this is how we ended up handling contracts in terms of staff and who has signature authority and these kinds of things. Because when you're managing this kind of money, and you've got to have deliverables, and USAID's looking over your shoulders, and they've got this huge mandatory standard guidelines thing that they're going to hit you over the head if you don't follow the rules. You've got to do things fairly efficiently, okay? So this is how we had to handle contracts. Here was the financial management. You can see the key financial person is actually over in Brazil. She yelled at me a lot too. And here's how we handled the technical implementation about the people who actually got to go out and talk to the communities. So there was a lot going on in the management of this consortium. So this is the other part of what I think Marianne's talking about, Stephen running the circus, okay, trying to keep track of all of this stuff. There were other consortia, this Andes Amazon Rim Consortium we had to form after we got kicked out of Bolivia. And this was really focused on capacity building in the universities, both individuals as well as institutions. And so we came up with a plan very quickly, knowing we only had a little while to do some things. And so I'm going to give you a bunch of pictures. So I began to recruit other UF faculty, such as the editor on the right, who you may know, to go down and talk to the Brazilians in this case. And you can see Venderson is still happy after he heard from Emilio what Emilio thought of Venderson's manuscript, all by way of helping these students find their way into publishing in international journals. We also led what we called the study visit, where we brought the Brazilians and the Peruvians from different parts of Peru together with the Colombians and the Ecuadorians and brought them all together in Madre de Dios, where all the problems of the Amazon are happening in the same place, to talk to each other about highways, about climate change, about gold mining, and about other issues. Okay? And so we brought them, here we are at the border with Cusco, okay, the proposed Inambari Dam site, and the local faculty are explaining, I think Betty's over here She was visiting as well, talking to people about dam planning. And so everybody's talking about dam planning in their respective countries out here. And I also got them together and had them do sort of hands-on exercises as they talked about common themes, but from different parts of the basin, okay? And here we have an empresario of a castaña processing plant, and all the Colombianas over there, what's castaña? And so they're explaining how these things work to each other. This is the MTFP. And of course, eventually they got to say what they thought of stuff and what they thought was similar in their experiences and different, and what might be done to address some of the challenges. We also brought university faculty together to do the kinds of things that John and Foster Brown and others are doing, trying to get faculty to rethink how they teach. And so here we have our consultants arguing with faculty about how to rethink their courses. And then everybody got to sort of write out how they would make changes in their courses. You see Elizabeth Anderson over here, one of our allies at FI. We also had what's called the knowledge exchange train. One of the things that has become clear, partly as a result of the social movements, is you no longer go in and gather data from somebody and then don't come back. Okay, they will not talk to you, and they shouldn't. Okay, data return, knowledge exchange are a big deal, and so one of our long-term allies, Elsa Mendoza, came up with this idea of the knowledge exchange train. I think she did it while she was here at UF years ago. Okay? And so the next year we went out and did a knowledge exchange train, and the idea here is to really scale up the outreach in every sense, to have not just one person go back to where they gather the data, but to have them travel with a bunch of other people with different kinds of findings to go to different locations. And so we have had several of these in different parts of the southwestern Amazon over time. Okay, so, and we do everything collaboratively when we do a knowledge exchange train. So we all have to have posters, and we have to have one copy of everybody's poster for every place we're going to visit, which means hundreds and hundreds of posters. So here we are laminating our posters. And then you've got to get to the site, right? And it may be easy, it may be hard, but once again,
most of it was easy.
Well, mostly it's easy, but occasionally not. But again, we have to pull the truck out of the mud together. Okay? And yes, then we go up the river, and if the canoe is taking on water, then we let the driver drive.
This is
There's Elsa. Yes, that was
Paulo Pinheiro.
just finished. That's right. All when we were young and innocent. And here's when we went up the Anita River. Okay, this was all part of a municipal territorial management planning exercise. We wanted to go meet with the communities, and then we came back and talked to the Sindicato, Prefeitura, and other actors. But that meant 11 days on the boat. You find out everybody's little habits, okay, when you're on the boat together for 11 days. But again, it was meetings on the boat. We were navigating together on the boat, okay. We were doing our presentations on the boat while everybody else was trying not to hit the submerged stumps, and so forth and so on. Over time, as we have done these things, we've become much more participatory in how we do this. So here you have our presenter is having the kids measure each other so they understand how to measure carbon in trees. And we've turned some of our train stops into poster sessions. Instead of getting up and talking, we just put up the posters, put out the food, and let people go where they want. Okay? Another thing we did on the most recent one is see Rafa explaining to one of the high school students we brought into the team how to give his presentation. And when we got to her high school, the Instituto de Tecnología in Iberia, she was the one who gave that presentation. So it was kind of an emotional thing for her to get up in front of her entire school. Okay? But we also had other allies as you went along that aided us in various, there's all kinds of stories. So now I'm going to go theoretical. Now I'm actually going to stop because I know we're running out of time. The classic reason why we go to all this trouble with all these crazy diagrams and huge management teams is because there is no other way to address certain kinds of problems, the famously wicked problems, that don't have simple solutions that one government agency or one disciplinary perspective are going to allow us to address. But if you can line up your interests with people who have complementary capacities, the management literature, which is where I've ended up going to look for these things, tells us that we can realize collaborative advantage. So we have to pay attention to this out of the applied behavioral sciences in order to look for ways to effectively create teams. But it's complicated because, things that John has talked about, Marianne as well, There are self-interests, okay? People do have deadlines. They have other commitments. You're crossing bridges in many cases at your own risk, okay? Because you're going above and beyond or beyond what your job description says you're supposed to be doing, okay? But if you understand that there are larger things at stake in the historical moment in the region, then these things become very important. There are strategic practices to manage the various challenges. This is my list that I put together for the book that Marianne mentioned. There's lots of lists out there, okay, about the things you have to deal with if you're going to collaborate effectively. Most people talk about introductions and that we have to learn how to communicate and we have to be able to tell each other what we mean when we use a word, so at least they understand even if they mean something else. Okay? Most people talk about finding common interests as opposed to focusing on what separates us, but also looking for complementary capacities. Lots of people will tell us, well, we have to have clear goals, and that's obvious enough. There's a huge literature, of course, on leadership and management, and there's a lot of discussion about expectations and benefits. It's the second and the last one that I think people have paid less attention to, perhaps because they're more sensitive, perhaps because they're harder to deal with. The first has to do with power and politics and inequalities. They're always there. You cross boundaries. They get bigger. It can lead to a lot of jealousies in the sense that the other guys and gals are hiding things from us. But then there's also surprise and uncertainty. Whenever you're working in a developing region where there's rapid change and this kind of a thing, where climate change is unfolding before us, there's always things that can happen that we hadn't expected. So this is what I spent a lot of time on talking about in the book. And instead of go theoretical on y'all, I'm going to pass around a little piece of paper here. And if you want, I can give you the magic table that I put in the book. You want to put your name and email there. That unpacks all this stuff. Okay. The chapter itself is like 80 pages long because it wasn't easy to explain this in a few words. But this is how I organized the book. And I'm going to skate through. Oh, and there's the book itself. They do have a couple copies in the library. And I'm going to zing through all of this and hopefully leave a few minutes for questions. Yeah, see, all the theory. But I do want to note, thanks, John, that tomorrow, which is going to go running out of here in a minute, book number 2 is due at the publisher. Okay, so book number 1 was all about all those projects I described. Book number 2 is about other people's projects in other parts of the world. So these are PIs on large NSF projects, these coupled natural and human system projects that cross multiple kinds of boundaries. They work with indigenous people, they worked in Africa, they worked in other parts of the world, and there's a couple Amazonian cases here. The idea was to get them to report back on what they had learned, okay? And there's some really interesting insights out of there and sort of similar lessons being learned even though you're at opposite ends of the world, okay? The folks working with people in Upper Mongolia ended up having some similar insights to those who were working with Menominee over in Wisconsin and things like that. So the idea here is to lay this out and talk about how we keep running into similar problems. It's not random, okay? As a means of opening discussions for you all and other future researchers and conservation and development practitioners to reflect on and to go less innocent and ignorant than I did when we went out to collaborate with many others. So I'll stop. Thank you.
Wow.